My plane crash-landed in the mountains. The cockpit was flooded with a warning signal that indicated engine failure. My veins filled with adrenaline as I struggled to restart the engine while I went through the emergency checklist of my Cessna 172. After several attempts, I failed to get any mechanical response and resorted to contacting air communications. Nothing but static. I was flying a plane with no power. Losing altitude, I scanned the ocean of trees ahead for a clearing in which I could bring down the plane safely. My GPS had become disoriented and was shifting directions repeatedly. I knew this was going to end badly. I remembered my training. Although I have covered this type of scenario several times, experiencing this firsthand was a terrifying new experience. The clouds above became darker. A heavy wind blew in from the north, which caused me to descend at a dangerous rate. I saw an opening of trees that gave promise, but there was no chance I could manage to safely meet the ground. I went for it. Heavy rain peppered my windshield, obscuring my vision. This is when I realized that I had lost all power to my vessel and was now flying a giant paper airplane. I lined up my landing as best I could and hoped for the best. I was about 50 feet from the ground when a tree collided with my left wing and completely tore it from the plane. That's when I knew I was knee-deep in shit creek and sinking like lead. I braced myself for impact. Whiplash sent me into a state of disarray, shattered glass piercing my skin. Rain broke through and hit me like a tidal wave. The moment my plane contacted the ground, I blacked out. A sharp pain in my side pulled me back to consciousness. I could hear roaring flames and the crackling of burning wood, but my vision took a bit of time to fully return. I undid my harness and reached down to identify the source of my pain. It felt like glass, and indeed it was, but it didn't feel deep enough to be fatal. I slowly removed the shard that protruded from just below my ribcage, and I felt a warm trail of blood leak out of the opening. Holding pressure on the wound, I squirmed out of the cockpit, making sure to grab the first aid kit, only to see the wreckage that was before me. My plane was destroyed. Fuel had spilled from the tanks and filled the air with its pungent odor. Something had caused the fuel to ignite, but it was slowly being extinguished by the heavy rainfall. A sense of dread washed over me as I came to the realization that not only had I crashed, but I was stranded in the middle of nowhere. Even from above, in every direction, there were only trees and cascading mountains that stretched far beyond my view. My radio was destroyed. Most of my belongings were trapped inside the plane, which was, at the time, completely engulfed in flames. I barely even managed to escape with only light injuries, and if I took a moment longer, I would have been burned alive. Thunder roared as I struggled to dress my wound, and proceeded to create some sort of shelter out of the remnants of my vessel in order to protect myself from the harsh weather. By the time I had finished, it was nightfall. I wandered around the woods and gathered as much dry wood as I could possibly find in the dark. Using the tools in my first aid kit, I managed to get a fire going and was able to keep warm enough to fall asleep. A faint cough woke me from my slumber. I stirred a bit, adjusting my body for comfort. Then I heard it again. This instantly grabbed my attention. The sound came from the other side of the fire. I opened one eye, hoping that whatever had made that sound didn't realize it had woke me up. Terror coursed through my veins as I saw what had invaded my shelter. It was a silhouette of what looked like a man, hunched over and mumbling something unintelligible to itself. The figure seemed completely nude, skinny, and unusually tall. I did my best not to move. The last thing I wanted was to provoke the creature. I watched it for a while, analyzing its odd movement. It seemed to be trying to warm itself, only it was more fascinated by the fire if I had to guess. It kept far enough away from the fire to where I couldn't pinpoint any distinct features other than what I could identify from its outline. This went on for quite some time. The human-like creature rocked back and forth, mumbling to itself in some strange way I couldn't understand. I was confused, but most of all, I was disturbed. I was supposed to be in a remote section of the northern wilderness. There were no known inhabitants of this area, and was strictly a no-land zone. Whatever resides in those woods are far from human. I did my best to mask my breathing. Any sign of consciousness could have drawn the creature's attention away from the fire and over to me. It seemed mesmerized by the crackling of the uncured wood and the red glow of the charred wood beneath the dying flame. An itch, a sensation that you'd get when you're lying in bed and suddenly are struck with the paranoia of a spider or other unwanted presence crawling up your leg. Your mind naturally wants you to reach and assure that it's just your nerves playing tricks on you, but you still smack the area anyways, hoping that if it were a spider, you put it to rest. This was a scenario much like that, but I couldn't indulge in those acts. I was tortured by the unrelenting worry that some arachnid had decided to explore the confines of my body, all of which was going on while I was in the presence of something far worse. Yet my mind stayed focused on the subtle tickling feeling that slowly made its way up my leg and just inches away from my groin. It took every ounce of self-control one man could muster to stop myself from shoving my hand down my pants and ridding myself of its intruder. Soon enough, the flame had died down to just the red glow of the charred wood. The creature suddenly snapped back into reality, and its neck cracked into a 90-degree turn while facing towards me. The glowing embers reflected in its abnormally large eyes as it stared directly at me. I stopped breathing altogether. The itch had been long forgotten, and the only thought that was present in my mind at the time was the hope that it hadn't noticed I was awake. It took a step towards me, tilting its head from side to side in an animalistic way. The creature gave the appearance of a man, yet I saw no genitalia, just smooth stone-like skin in place of where it should be. I shut my eyes and expected the worst. The snapping of branches broke the silence, and I could hear a loud snort rise from the creature's throat, followed by rapid footsteps fleeing from my presence. After a few moments of what I thought were my last, I opened my eyes one by one, only to see the creature had vanished. The forest was silent once again, other than the crackling of the fire's remains. That night I did not rest. I laid there in silence, jumping at any sound that emitted from the darkness beyond the trees. Anxiety had consumed me for the night, and in my physical state at the time, I was in no shape to defend myself. A few days went by, and I'd seen no other signs of that strange creature. I spent most of what daylight I had collecting firewood and salvaging parts of the plane's wreckage to build myself a much more suitable shelter. During the evening, I would relentlessly attempt to make any human contact via the radio, but to no avail. I started to become depressed. I felt as if I was going to die in those woods, alone, forgotten, and knowing that not a single person knew of my location. I was just a tiny speck in an ocean of trees that made it nearly impossible to find me. Even if I managed to build the fire large enough to be seen from overhead, I could be leading that creature right back to my camp. Even worse, there could be more than just one of them. I did my best not to think about it that night. It wouldn't do me any good. I did my best to stay focused, get familiar with my surroundings, find clean water, and hope that I hadn't steered too far off course that search and rescue couldn't find me. However, that soon became the least of my worries. About a week later, I was collecting water from a creek that I had found about 5 miles away from my campsite when I spotted something out of place. At first, I thought it was a hallucination. I rubbed my eyes and blinked several times until realizing that it was exactly what I had seen. Perched on the branch of a tree, just a few feet out of arm's reach, was a video camera. "What in the fuck is that doing here?" I said to myself out loud. A wire ran down from the camera along the base of the tree and directly into the ground. I tore at the dirt with my bare hands in a fury, hoping to trace it to its source, but there was no luck. I only managed to get a foot or two into the ground when I hit solid concrete. That's right, concrete. The type of concrete you'd use to make a sidewalk or a set of stairs, with the wire from the camera leading directly into it. That was when I nearly broke down. I thought I was going mad. I first started to sob. That soon turned into blinding fury. I leapt up and grabbed a lower hanging branch from the tree, pulling myself up high enough to grab the device, and tossed it onto the ground. After that, I proceeded to smash the camera to pieces. only to realize that I had wasted precious daylight and was not going to make it back to camp before sundown. I had a strict rule that I would never explore the woods after dark. Each night I would fall asleep while anxiously watching the line of trees, hoping the creature I had seen my first night wouldn't decide to come back. There were many times that I had contemplated killing myself, putting an end to my misery, but I always reflected on something my father once said to me as a child. "Giving up is for cowards. If you don't give it 100%, you're nothing more than that. I wouldn't be who I am today had I given up. You wouldn't be here today. You were a miracle, son. The doctors told me you wouldn't live past the first 6 months, but here you are, alive and well. That's proof that anything is possible, no matter what the circumstances. Remember that." My father was a wise man and an experienced pilot, one of the best. My mother passed away when I was 5 and left my father and I to fend for ourselves. If there was such a thing as tough love, my father was the epitome of that. But he was also a very caring man. No matter what the circumstances, he'd make sure he'd get the job done. Lives depended on him. My father was responsible for delivering medical supplies to refugee camps during World War II. These camps were often inaccessible to any land vehicle, so to supply the medical teams on site, they would require an airdrop that was more than risky since they were located behind enemy lines. My father was a great man. Even after the war, he used his resources to help as many people as he could, up until the day he died. Even though I didn't want to follow in his footsteps and become a pilot myself, but instead a journalist, he was always supportive. But things changed after I had been notified that he passed away in his sleep from a cardiac arrest. I quit my job, moved back to Alaska, and made the decision to become a pilot in honor of his name. I loved my father, and he was the only family I had left, and once he was gone, I was alone. There I was, about 5 miles away from camp and losing daylight fast. If you've ever seen a man run for his life, then you can imagine what I looked like. Jumping over fallen trees, being whipped by branches that I didn't care to avoid, I was set on making it back to the camp as soon as possible, before I was lost in the dark, ominous woods that held mysteries far beyond my imagination's capabilities. My heart kept pace with my legs, and my lungs worked just as hard as I navigated through the seemingly endless congregation of trees, until I was met by something so terrifying that to this day it haunts me. I stopped dead in my tracks and listened. It was a sound I had recognized from my first night here. The mumbling, but this time it wasn't just one voice, it was dozens of them. The voices drew nearer. My body that was once burning hot with adrenaline was now as cold as ice. I could hear the rustling of the leaves underneath their footsteps, the collective voices that muttered endless phrases that I was yet able to identify. It all stopped once we made visual contact. A phalanx of what seemed to be 50 or even more stood in front of me. They too were frozen in place, each one's large, round eyes fixated on mine. My first instinct should have been to flee, but my legs had locked into place. There wasn't much anywhere I could go. I was greatly outnumbered, and they each stood at a height of easily 7 feet tall or more. This is when I got a much better look at what they were. Their skin was a stone gray. Their body was like ours, yet only in a slight sense. Long arms hung far below their waists, nearly stopping at their knees. No identifying genitalia, no body hair. They had pale, smooth faces, but they didn't have a nose. Only 2 small dime-sized holes instead. Their mouths were like a small black slit, just a few inches below their nostrils, and it rapidly moved as it repeated the same words over and over. It was a sight that one could only imagine in their worst nightmares. Only mine wasn't. It was real. We stood there in a deadlock for at least 5 minutes until one of them took a step towards me. In reaction, I took a step back. Then, in unison, every other creature followed with a step forward as well. With each long step they took, I returned with another moving away. Their legs were a lot longer than mine, which in result allowed them to gain on me. I made the only choice I had at the time: run. I spun on my heels and sprinted as fast as I could into the darkness. I had no sense of direction, and my only thought was to escape these abominations' clutches. Above the sound of my own feet smacking against the forest floor, I could hear the heavy wheezing and choir of unintelligible muttering from my pursuers. It only grew louder as I ran further into the woods, knowing that at any moment they'd catch me. Adrenaline had kept me going, but soon I noticed a few green blinking lights that were scattered amongst the trees ahead. It didn't take long to realize that there were more of those cameras. Further examination revealed that it had not just been a few cameras. There were hundreds, even thousands of them, all scattered throughout the woods. It was as if you were peering into a clear night sky that was full of distant stars and planets, only that is what I had wished I was seeing. They all blinked in unison as I blindly ran deeper into the woods, only to see that the ocean of lights didn't end. It just stretched out endlessly. I had become so distracted that I didn't notice the large boulder in front of me. At the speed I was going, my body completely lifted from the ground and my weight was thrown off balance, which sent me flying head first into a tree. As I lay there, hoping that my death would be quick and painless, I watched them gather around me, still repeating that same damn phrase. Their faces came closer and closer, then soon, only inches away from my own. That's when everything went black. A loud whirring and heavy gusts pulled me out of my unconscious state. I immediately recognized the source. Soon came several armed men in camouflage uniforms, which picked me up and carried me away. It was daylight then. I had no clue why I was still alive, nor how long had passed since my nasty spill. I was only conscious for a few moments until a sense of relief allowed me to drift back into the darkness. I was awoken again by the sound of medical machinery. I went to reach for my head, which was throbbing, only to see that I had been restrained to the hospital bed with handcuffs. A man in uniform entered my room shortly after. I don't want to get into the details, but I will say that he interrogated me for hours, asking the same questions over and over. Why were you flying in restricted airspace? What did you see? Were there any passengers? I lied about what I had seen, knowing it would only get me into more trouble. I didn't have any passengers, which would have been obvious if they had found the wreckage, since I was flying alone. They didn't believe me at first, and had me detained for several days until they finally took me home, but not until they forced me to sign an agreement that I would not release any information about my week in the woods. I don't know what kind of experiments they had going on in that place. I don't think I really want to know. All that I can say is that I will not be staying around here much longer. They may come looking for me after writing this, but I had to get it out. Maybe it will settle my anxiety. I feel as if I'm under constant surveillance. I'm hoping that it's just paranoia. Whatever the case may be, I'm leaving this for you to decide, as I have an appointment with a man about a plane.